Dr. Richard Mendez, one of New York's most prominent lawyers, had no idea of the mistake he was about to make. Looking at Mrs. Helen, the maid who had been serving coffee in the office for 8 months, he said with a mocking smile, "If you can win the Oliveira family's case against Global Tech, I'll give you $150,000 out of my own pocket." "That's right, $150,000. The other lawyers laughed derisively, and Dr. Richard added, "Of course, that'll never happen, will it? You even take good care of our coffee. But the law is too complicated." What Dr. Richard didn't know was that he had just made a promise to the wrong person, the very, very wrong one. To understand this story, we need to go back a few months. The Mendez and Associates firm, located in the heart of New York, was one of the most respected in the city. Dr. Richard was known not only for winning difficult cases, but also for treating with arrogance those he considered inferior. 8 months earlier, Mrs. Helen had arrived at the office looking for a job. She desperately needed money and accepted the position as a waitress, even though she had a degree in another field. From day one, Dr. Richard made it clear how things would work. "Mrs. Helen, everyone has their place here. You take care of the coffee, the cleaning, and you don't interfere in the lawyer's affairs. Understand?" "Yes, sir. Understood." But Mrs. Helen carried a secret he hadn't revealed to anyone since his life had completely changed 3 years earlier. The case that would bring this secret to light was that of John Oliveira's family. He owned a small technology company and had developed promising software. But the American giant Global Tech stole his idea, and in a short time, John lost everything, more than $2 million. His voice breaking, John begged for help. "Dr. Richard, this company has destroyed my life. My children can no longer go to school. Please do something." Dr. Richard took a deep breath and replied coldly, "John, I'll be honest with you. Global Tech has the best lawyers in the United States. Your case is almost impossible to win. But since you were a friend of my father's, I'll try something." For 8 months, Dr. Richard and his 5 best lawyers fought every avenue and failed every time. Now there were only 48 hours left until the final hearing. It was a Friday, 7 o'clock at night. Dr. Richard reviewed the case papers for the 100th time, nervous and frustrated. "No way," he grumbled. "How does this company always get away with it? It's like they know every move before we even make it." Meanwhile, Mrs. Helen was organizing some documents on the table, her eyes fixed on a small detail, something all the lawyers had missed. She took a deep breath and spoke cautiously. "Excuse me, Dr. Richard. Can I ask you a question?" He looked up, irritated. "Mrs. Helen, I've already explained that you don't need to worry about legal matters. Go back to breakfast, it's time." But she insisted, in a firm yet respectful voice, "I noticed something strange about this Global Tech contract with a company in the United States." Silence filled the room. Dr. Richard raised his eyebrows and, with irony, replied, "So now the waitress has become an expert in international contracts? Please, Mrs. Helen, leave this to someone who understands." But there was something in her voice, a certainty that didn't match that of a simple kitchen worker. Helen pointed to the sheet and calmly explained, "Clause 15.3 of this contract violates Section 301 of U.S. law. If this is presented in court, the whole case changes." The office fell into absolute silence. Dr. Richard looked at the maid, surprised. How do you know about this American law?" Helen hesitated for a moment. Then she answered simply, "I read about it in a magazine." But Dr. Richard wasn't naive. He knew the law was extremely complex, something not all lawyers understood well. And in that moment, he realized there was much more to Mrs. Helen than met the eye. Dr. Richard quickly picked up the document Helen had indicated. "Read it once, twice, 3 times. His face turned pale. My God. How come no one noticed this before? It was clear there was something wrong with the contract. But still, Richard couldn't believe a maid had noticed what his legal team had failed to do in 8 months. "Mrs. Helen, tell me something. How exactly do you know this American law?" Helen tried to disguise it, choosing her words carefully. I took some courses. I've always enjoyed studying this kind of subject." Richard narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Courses? Mrs. Helen, you just cited a law that took me years to understand." It was at that moment that Helen blurted out, without realizing it, "It's just that when I worked with—" She stopped suddenly, realizing her slip. Richard didn't let it go. "Where did you work, Mrs. Helen?" She took a deep, nervous breath. No, I meant when I was studying. But it was too late. The damage was done." Richard leaned his elbows on the table, looked at Helen intently, and said, "Mrs. Helen, sit down, now. I want you to tell me the truth. Who are you really?" Helen closed her eyes for a moment, knowing she could no longer hide her identity. With a firm but emotion-laden voice, she replied, I'm not just an ordinary waitress, Dr. Richard. I studied law at an American university." Richard's eyes widened in astonishment. "What university?" Helen took a deep breath and said, "Columbia Law School." The silence that followed was absolute. "Columbia?" Richard almost whispered. "One of the best law schools in the world. And you're here, serving coffee?" The revelation fell like a bomb. Columbia Law School produced some of the best lawyers on the planet. Dr. Richard leaned back in his chair in disbelief. "Mrs. Helen, this doesn't make any sense. If you studied at a university like this, why are you here, working as a waitress?" Helen lowered her eyes. It was time to reveal at least part of the truth. "I graduated 5 years ago. I was at the top of my class. My specialty was international law and intellectual property." "One of the best?" Richard asked, still trying to process. "You mean you were among the top students?" "Among the top 3, she confirmed. "I've received offers from the biggest firms in New York, Boston, and Los Angeles." Richard shook his head, confused. "And what happened?" Helen hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly on the table. "I accepted a position at a large firm in Manhattan. The salary was $300,000 a year. I worked on billion-dollar cases, alongside renowned partners." Richard almost choked on the number. $300,000 a year? That's almost 2 million Rs. Why would anyone give up something like that? Helen's eyes began to fill with tears. "Because I discovered something I shouldn't have. And when I tried to do the right thing, my life became hell." Richard leaned forward, curiosity now dominating his voice. "What did you discover?" Helen took a deep breath and said firmly, "Corruption. American and Brazilian companies laundering money, paying bribes, manipulating contracts. All hidden in processes I myself followed." Richard was shocked. "And did you report it?" Helen nodded, tears already streaming down her face. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I took evidence to the FBI and the IRS. But the companies were too powerful." Richard's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "What did they do to you?" Helen closed her eyes and replied in a pained tone, "They destroyed me. They spread the word that I was unbalanced, that I made up lies. No office in the United States would hire me anymore. I had no choice. I had to return to Brazil with nothing." Dr. Richard took a few seconds to process everything. The woman he had treated as unimportant was, in fact, one of the most skilled lawyers he had ever met. He ran his hand over his face, embarrassed. "Mrs. Helen, do you have any idea how I feel right now? For 8 months I treated you like—" She interrupted him calmly. "Like someone worthless." "I know." Richard shook his head, troubled by his own conscience. "But why did you accept? Why didn't you tell me from the beginning who you really were?" Helen discreetly wiped away her tears and replied in a firm voice. "Because I needed to start over. My reputation was destroyed. I thought that if I worked quietly, proving my worth little by little, maybe one day I'd get another chance. Richard insisted, still not understanding. But you could have opened your own office. With that knowledge, that training, it would have been a success. Helen sighed, her voice thick with pain. With what money? I spent all my savings fighting in the American justice system. I returned to Brazil with only 3,000 reais and a seriously ill husband to care for. Richard looked up in surprise. Was your husband sick? Helen nodded, her voice now cracking. Cancer, a very aggressive type. Treatment cost 8,000 reais a month. That's why I accepted any job, any humiliation. Every penny I earned went toward his medication. Richard swallowed hard, his voice filled with compassion. And now? Helen took a deep breath, holding back tears. He passed away last year. I managed to care for him until the end, but I was left with a mountain of debt. Silence filled the room. Richard lowered his head, embarrassed, but also in admiration. Mrs. Helen, you could have sued me for mistreatment dozens of times. She shook her head. I didn't want any problems. I just wanted to work in peace. I just wanted to pay my bills. Richard looked again at the contract she had pointed to minutes earlier. Now his voice sounded different, filled with respect. About this loophole you found, are you absolutely sure? Helen looked up for the first time with confidence. Yes, I do. I worked on 3 similar cases in New York. Global Tech always uses the same contract template. They think no one in Brazil knows American laws. Richard swallowed hard. And do you know her? Helen replied without hesitation. Dr. Richard, I spent 2 years handling only intellectual property cases between Brazil and the United States. This kind of detail is exactly my specialty. Dr. Richard looked at Helen in a completely different way. I no longer saw the humble waitress who served coffee every day. Before him was a world expert on exactly the kind of case he needed to win. He took a deep breath and asked seriously, Mrs. Helen, I'll be blunt. If you took on this case, would you be able to win? Helen stared at him steadily, never taking her eyes off him. Not only would you win, you'd be able to prove that Global Tech acted with deliberate fraud. This would pave the way for much greater compensation. Richard's eyes widened in surprise. A higher compensation? Are you saying that, Helen added without hesitation, instead of just 2 million, the Oliveira family could receive 10? Maybe $15 million. Furthermore, Global Tech would be forced to change its abusive practices against small businesses. Richard's heart raced. This was more than a legal victory. It was the chance of a lifetime. But the hearing is on Monday. We only have 48 hours. Helen replied calmly but with conviction. That's enough time. But I'd need access to all the files, the freedom to develop my own strategy, and the confidence to work my way. Richard was silent for a few seconds. He knew he was at a crossroads. He could continue with his wounded pride, or admit that he needed that woman. He took a deep breath, his voice choked with shame. Mrs. Helen, I must apologize. For 8 months I treated you very badly, without even realizing who you really were. She shook her head gently. You didn't know, Dr. Richard. No, he interrupted. That's no excuse. Even if she was just a waitress, she deserved respect, always. But now, I need your help. I'm willing to acknowledge that in front of everyone. It was then that Richard made the decision that would change everything. Mrs. Helen, I give you carte blanche in this case. You take responsibility. I'll be by your side. And if we win, when we win, in addition to the $150,000 I promised, I'll offer something more. Helen looked at him in surprise. Anything else? A partnership, he declared. Mendes and Silva attorneys. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Helen put her hand to her mouth, astonished. Society. Yes. Richard confirmed firmly. A new era begins now. What happened in the next 48 hours was simply extraordinary. Helen took command like a true strategist. The first thing he did was to discard the entire approach Richard and his team had been using. Dr. Richard, forget everything you've done so far. You were attacking the wrong points. She reorganized documents, opened old folders, and made international calls. Her demeanor had completely changed. She was no longer the shy waitress who walked silently through the hallways. She was the Columbia-trained lawyer, precise as a surgeon. Helen worked tirelessly. He called former colleagues in the United States, accessed confidential files, and set up an unprecedented line of attack. Hello, Jennifer. This is Helen Silva. I need an urgent favor regarding the global tech contracts. On the other end of the line, influential contacts responded attentively. Richard watched in fascination, almost in disbelief. Mrs. Helen, who are you speaking to? She smiled slightly as she took notes. With former colleagues who now work at the SEC, the commission that regulates the American financial markets. They confirmed that global tech is already being investigated for similar practices in other countries. On Sunday night, the day before the hearing, Helen presented a complete plan. Dr. Richard, we have 3 main lines of attack. First, violation of U.S. law. Second, intentional contract fraud. Third, a 2019 Supreme Court precedent that no one has dared to use here in Brazil. Richard's eyes widened. How do you know a precedent from 2019? Helen smiled discreetly. Because I was at that hearing. I represented the other side. We lost the case, but I learned every detail of the decision. On the morning of the hearing, while Richard trembled with anxiety, Helen remained serene. Dr. Richard, trust me, today, justice will be served. The courtroom was packed that Monday morning. On one side, the powerful global tech, with a team of 8 American and Brazilian lawyers. Leading them was the famous Dr. Hamilton Pierce, known for never having lost a case in Brazil. He stood up confidently and declared, Your Honor, this case has already been tried in all instances. Global tech acted within the law. It was then that Helen stood up, an unknown lady in front of the most feared corporate lawyer in the country. The audience began to whisper. With a firm voice, she introduced herself. Your Honor, my name is Helen Silva. Today I will prove that global tech not only violated Brazilian law, but also violated American law. Dr. Pierce sneered confidently. Your Honor, you are mistaken. Section 301 does not apply to this case. Helen held his gaze, serene, as if she had been expecting that exact answer. Dr. Pierce, do you remember the Morrison v. National Australia Bank case decided by the Supreme Court in 2019? Pierce's expression changed. He knew the precedent, and he knew the weight it carried. Helen then continued, relentless. In that ruling, the Supreme Court made it clear that American companies cannot use subsidiary agreements to circumvent intellectual property laws in other countries. He then took a set of unpublished documents from his briefcase. Your Honor, here are internal global tech emails. In these records, executives openly discuss how to circumvent Brazilian intellectual property laws. The court fell silent. Pierce turned pale. Your Excellency, how were these documents obtained? Helen responded firmly without losing control. Through judicial cooperation between Brazil and the United States, something you perhaps should have investigated before standing up here. For 2 hours, Helen dismantled each of Global Tech's arguments, one by one. He cited laws, precedents, and international treaties. He spoke so naturally that it felt like he was in his own classroom. The judge, impressed, asked one last question. Dr. Helen, are you sure these violations were intentional? She didn't hesitate. Your Honor, Global Tech uses the same contract structure in 12 different countries. When the same loophole is repeated in so many places, it's not a mistake. It's a system. With every word, the scales of justice tipped against the American giant. The court remained in absolute silence as the judge arranged the papers before him. Then, in a solemn voice, he announced the decision. In light of the evidence presented by Dr. Helen Silva, this court finds in favor of the Oliveira family. Global Tech Corporation must pay $12 million in material and moral damages, plus $3 million in punitive damages, $15 million, 7 times more than the family had lost. But the judge didn't stop there. Furthermore, I order Global Tech to immediately modify its abusive practices and publish a new intellectual property policy valid throughout the national territory. Dr. Pierce was devastated. In his 20-year career, he had never suffered such a humiliating defeat. He approached Helen and whispered, "Dr. Helen, what office do you work in? I'd like to make you a proposal." Helen smiled serenely. "I work at Mendes and Silva Attorneys, Dr. Pierce." "Partner?" he asked in disbelief. "Partner," she confirmed, proudly. Outside the courthouse, the Oliveira family wept with joy. John hugged her tightly, overcome with emotion. "Dr. Helen, how can I thank you? You saved my family." She returned the hug and replied sweetly, "John, justice has been served, and that's what matters." Among the journalists surrounding the exit, Richard spoke. His voice trembled with emotion. "I want to say something publicly. For 8 months, I had the honor of working alongside Dr. Helen, and I was too blind to see her true value. She's not just one of the best lawyers I've ever met. She's one of the best people." Then, in front of everyone, he handed her the promised envelope. "Here's the $150,000. But this is just the beginning. I've learned more about humility and fairness in the last 3 days than I have in 15 years of my career." Helen held the envelope, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Richard. But what matters most is that now I can pay off all my husband's treatment debts, and also help other families avoid going through what I went through." 6 months later, the Mendes and Silva firm had become a benchmark in international law. Helen had created an entire department dedicated to defending small business owners against large corporations. And Richard? He had become her greatest champion, repeating the same lesson to anyone who would listen. Never underestimate anyone. The person you despise today may be the very person who saves your life tomorrow. But the biggest transformation was in Helen's life. She had finally found her place. Not to enrich the powerful, but to give a voice to those who never had one. And whenever a new employee arrived at the office, Richard made a point of reminding them, treat everyone with respect and dignity. You never know who they really are. That victory changed destinies. For the Oliveira family, it meant a fresh start. The children were able to return to school, and their father's dignity was restored in front of everyone. For Richard, it was a turning point. The man who had once prided himself on his arrogance was now remembered for his humility and the courage to recognize the value of those he had ignored. And for Helen, it was rebirth. After years of humiliation, loss, and silent struggles, she was back where she always belonged. But this time, with an even greater mission. At Mendes and Silva, she didn't defend billion-dollar corporations, but small business owners, simple families, ordinary people who had never had a voice against power. Their expertise, once used to enrich giants, now served to protect the most vulnerable. And with each case won, each injustice righted, Helen remembered her husband, his struggles, his silent promise to never give up. Richard, in turn, became his greatest ally. He always repeated to the team and clients, "Remember, never take anyone for granted. The person you treat as invisible today could be the one who saves your life tomorrow." And so, the story of the forgotten waitress, who was actually one of the greatest lawyers of her generation, echoed as a lesson in justice, courage, and transformation. Helen Silva had finally found her true purpose. And if you like this story, get ready. Here on the channel you will find many other stories of justice, courage, and unexpected twists and turns. Sign up now, activate the bell, and discover how many life lessons are hidden where you least expect them. Because, in the end, the truth always comes out. And no one, absolutely no one, is as invisible as they seem.